The day Julian's brother stood up at the family dinner table and called him pathetic for spending his own money on a student who wasn't even his blood, Julian said nothing. He just picked up his fork and kept eating. His sister-in-law laughed into her glass of wine. His mother looked away. His father shook his head like Julian had committed some embarrassing crime. And Julian sat there in the house he had helped pay for, at the table he had helped furnish, surrounded by people he had given years of loyalty to, and he thought about a 12-year-old boy sitting in the back row of a classroom with no shoes that fit. That boy had worn the same pair of broken sneakers for 3 months. The left sole was peeling off. Julian had noticed. Nobody else had. And that simple act of noticing, that one small human decision to see a child that the rest of the world kept walking past, was the thing his own family mocked him for. They thought they were laughing at his weakness. They had no idea they were laughing at the beginning of their own undoing. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honest. Have you ever been kind to someone, genuinely kind, no agenda, no expectation, just real human care, and then had the people closest to you treat that kindness like a character flaw? Have you ever loved people who made you feel small for having a good heart? If you have, then stay with me. Because Julian's story is not just about what happened to him. It is about what happens when a person finally stops explaining themselves to people who were never really listening. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think some betrayals can ever be forgiven. Tell me what you would have done. And then don't move, because the story is just getting started. Julian was not a man who complained. That was the first thing anyone who knew him would tell you. He was a middle school science teacher in a small city, the kind of teacher who stayed late, who remembered every student's name, who kept a small jar of peppermints on his desk because he had learned early in his career that some kids came to school without breakfast. He made $38,000 a year. He drove a car that was 11 years old and made a sound every time he went over 40 miles per hour that he had learned to ignore. He packed his own lunch every day. He bought his clothes at the end of season sales. He was not poor, but he was careful. And he was careful because he had a plan for his money that went beyond himself. Julian grew up in a house where money was tight and pride was tighter. His father, Raymond, had worked in a printing factory for 26 years and acted like that suffering entitled him to opinions about everyone else's choices. His mother, Diane, had spent most of her life managing her husband's moods and calling it peace. Julian had one brother, Marcus, who was 4 years older and had made more money in commercial real estate than anyone in the family had expected. Marcus wore that money the way some people wear armor, loudly, defensively, like he was daring someone to challenge him, and he had a wife, Priya, who had absorbed his values so completely that it was sometimes hard to tell where his opinions ended and hers began. Julian was the quiet one, the teacher, the man who fixed things around the family home on weekends and never sent a bill, the man who loaned his father money twice and never brought it up again. The man who had, for most of his adult life, been treated like the family's soft spot, the one who would absorb whatever was needed, ask for nothing, and smile at Sunday dinner like everything was fine. For a long time, everything was not fine, but Julian had learned to keep that to himself. The boy's name was Darius Cole. He was 12 years old when Julian first noticed him. It was October, early in the school year, and the weather had shifted fast that year, turning cold before anyone was ready. Darius sat in the third row from the back in Julian's fourth period science class. He was quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from shyness, the kind that comes from learning early that drawing attention to yourself costs something. Julian had seen that kind of quiet before. He recognized it because he had worn it himself as a boy. What Julian noticed first was not the shoes. It was the way Darius walked. There was a small, almost imperceptible tilt to his left step, a tiny adjustment in the way he put his foot down like he was protecting something. Julian watched it for 2 weeks before he looked down during a class activity and saw the left sneaker clearly. The sole was separating from the upper half of the shoe. Someone had tried to fix it with a strip of electrical tape that had since peeled back. The shoe was also too small. Julian could see the outline of Darius's toes pressing against the front. He was 12 years old and walking on damaged shoes that did not fit, and he had said nothing to anyone. Because somewhere along the way he had learned that saying you needed something was the same as admitting you were a burden. Julian knew exactly what that felt like. He did not make a scene. He did not call Darius to his desk in front of the other students and make him the subject of classroom charity, because Julian understood that nothing destroys a child's dignity faster than public pity. Instead, he waited until after class when the room had emptied, and he asked Darius to stay back for a minute under the pretense of going over an assignment. He talked about the assignment for exactly 3 sentences. Then he said, simply and quietly, that he had noticed Darius's shoes and that he was going to pick up a pair over the weekend and leave them in a bag by his locker on Monday with no note, no announcement, and no discussion required. Darius stared at him for a long moment, then he asked why. Julian said, because someone did something similar for me when I was your age, and I never forgot it. That is the only reason. Darius nodded. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. Julian could see it in the way the boy's jaw unclenched, in the way his shoulders dropped half an inch from where he had been holding them up near his ears. On Monday morning, Julian left a paper bag by locker 114. Inside were a pair of quality running shoes in Darius's size, 2 pairs of thick socks, and nothing else. No card, no name, no lesson attached. He never mentioned it again in class. What Julian did not know, could not have known, was that Darius Cole had a memory like a steel trap. That boy remembered everything. He remembered the exact temperature of kindness and the exact temperature of cruelty, and he stored both with equal precision. He remembered that his science teacher had seen him when no one else did, had moved quietly so that Darius would not have to feel small, and had asked for absolutely nothing in return. That kind of thing does not leave a person. It becomes part of the architecture of who they are. But Julian did not know any of that yet. He was just a teacher who had bought a pair of shoes. His family, on the other hand, had opinions. It came out at Thanksgiving dinner that year. Julian made the mistake of mentioning it casually, the way you mention something you are not ashamed of, as a small story that came up naturally in conversation. Marcus put down his fork immediately. He looked at Julian the way you look at someone who has just said something baffling. He asked how much the shoes cost. Julian said around $65. Marcus laughed, not warmly, the kind of laugh that is actually contempt wearing a costume. He looked at Priya, and she made a small sound that communicated agreement without requiring her to actually speak. His father shook his head. His mother looked at her plate. Marcus said that Julian was throwing money away on someone else's problem. He said the boy's parents should be buying his shoes. He said that Julian was always doing things like this, always spending on people who weren't his responsibility, always confusing generosity with foolishness. He said, and this was the part Julian remembered most clearly, that being a good person was one thing but being a sucker was another, and Julian needed to learn the difference. Julian sat with that. He did not argue. He picked up his fork. He kept eating. But something moved in him, quiet and slow, like a stone turning over at the bottom of a river. He thought about the $65. He thought about his brother's second car, the one that sat in the driveway of the family home being used to make a point about how successful Marcus was. He thought about the 2 loans he had given his father that had never been returned, loans that totaled $4,000, loans that his father had never once mentioned again at a dinner table. He thought about the 6 weekends he had given up to help his parents move, to fix the porch, to repaint the back fence. He thought about all of it, and he thought about a 12-year-old boy walking with a tilt in his step to protect a shoe that was falling apart. And he decided, quietly, inside himself, that Marcus had absolutely no idea what the difference between a sucker and a decent human being actually was. He said nothing out loud, he just stored it. The years moved. Julian kept teaching. He stayed in the same classroom, put the same jar of peppermints on the same desk, and continued noticing the students that other people walked past. Darius Cole moved through middle school and then through high school, and Julian lost track of him the way teachers eventually lose track of students when the natural flow of time carries them in different directions. But Julian thought about him sometimes. He hoped the boy was okay. He hoped the shoes had helped, not just the physical shoes, but the message inside the gesture. The message that said, "You are worth being seen." At home, meaning his own apartment, because Julian had always been careful not to disappear into the family's needs entirely. Life was steadier. Julian had a woman in his life for 4 years, a nurse named Claudette, who understood him in the quiet way that certain people understand each other, without requiring a lot of explanation. She left eventually, not dramatically, but because she said Julian had made the family his emotional home instead of building one of his own. She said it without anger. Julian knew she was right. He sat with that too. He kept putting money away. Every month, a fixed amount went into an investment account he had opened 8 years earlier. It was not a glamorous amount. but it was consistent and it was his, and nobody else knew it existed. He had learned, watching his father, that the most dangerous thing a kind man could do was be financially transparent with people who confused generosity with an obligation they could draw against whenever they needed something. Marcus, over those years, built his real estate business into something real and profitable. He bought a large house in the suburbs with a kitchen that had been featured in a local design magazine. Priya drove a car that cost more than Julian made in a year. They had 2 children who were enrolled in private school. And at every family gathering, every birthday, every holiday dinner, the unspoken message was the same. Marcus had won. Marcus had figured it out. Marcus knew how the world worked. And Julian, the teacher, the quiet one with the old car and the classroom full of peppermints, had made the sentimental choice and was living with the soft consequences of it. Julian let them believe that. Then his father got sick. Raymond had a stroke in the spring of the year Julian turned 43. It was not immediately fatal, but it was serious enough to require a level of care that changed the shape of everything. His mother could not manage the house and Raymond's needs simultaneously. There were medical bills. There was equipment. There was the question of what kind of support Raymond would need going forward. Marcus came to the first family meeting in person, which Julian had expected. What Julian had not expected was what Marcus proposed at that meeting. Marcus sat at the head of the dining room table, in his father's usual chair, and laid out a financial plan for Raymond's care with the efficiency of a business presentation. It was, Julian had to admit, organized. It was also almost entirely designed to minimize what Marcus would personally contribute. The proposal was that the family home would be sold, and the proceeds used to fund a care facility for Raymond. The family home, which was worth roughly $320,000 in the current market. The family home that Julian had spent more collective hours maintaining, repairing, and improving than any other person in the family. The family home where his father's name was on the deed, and his mother's name was not. A detail Diane had never pushed back on because she had trusted Raymond, and because she had been raised to trust that trust was enough. Julian asked calmly where his mother would live if the house was sold. Marcus said Diane could move in with Julian, since Julian had a 2-bedroom apartment and lived alone. Julian looked at his brother for a long moment. He looked at Priya, who was nodding slowly with her hands folded in her lap. He looked at his mother, who was staring at the centerpiece of the table like it held an answer. Julian said he would need some time to review everything. Marcus said there was not a lot of time, because the market was favorable right now. Julian said he understood, and he left. That night Julian called a lawyer, not a family friend, a real estate and estate attorney whose name he had found through research rather than referral. He made an appointment for the following Tuesday. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. He also pulled out the folder he had kept in the bottom drawer of his home office for the past 6 years. Inside that folder were receipts, records, and photographs. There was a detailed log he had kept of every repair and improvement he had made to the family home, every material he had purchased, every contractor he had coordinated when the job was too large for him alone. There were receipts going back 14 years. The total material cost alone, not counting his own labor, not counting the weekends, not counting the times he had driven 40 minutes each way to get a specific part his father needed, came to $21,430. There was also documentation of the 2 loans to his father. Both had been made by personal check. Julian had kept the carbon copies. He brought all of it to the attorney. The attorney, a measured woman named Patricia Osai, reviewed the folder without any visible surprise. She had seen this story before, she said. She had seen it many times. A family member contributes, maintains, shows up, and is then treated as the option of last resort rather than a stakeholder when decisions get made. She told Julian what his legal position actually was, and she told him what documentation he would need to formalize it. She also told him something that Julian had suspected, but never had confirmed in plain language. His contributions to the property, if properly documented and argued, constituted a basis for a legal claim against the estate that any competent family law judge would take seriously. Julian did not want to sue his family. He made that clear. Patricia said, "Then we make sure your family knows that you could." There is a difference between throwing a punch and letting someone know your hands are not tied behind your back. Julian nodded. He liked that framing. He went home and he sat in his kitchen and he thought about the boy with the peeling shoe. He thought about how Darius had stood in that classroom doorway and asked why. And Julian had said, because someone did something similar for me once, and I never forgot it. He thought about what it meant to never forget. He thought about what it meant to be the person in the room who actually paid attention. He picked up his phone and drafted a message to Marcus. It was 3 sentences long. It said that he had engaged legal counsel to review the family's financial situation. It said he wanted a full accounting of all assets, debts, and contributions before any decisions were finalized. It said he was available to talk on Thursday evening. He sent it and put the phone face down on the counter. Marcus called back in 11 minutes. The call was not friendly. Marcus used words like betrayal and selfishness, which Julian found interesting given the context. Marcus said Julian was making this harder than it needed to be. Julian said he agreed, and that he hoped Marcus would come to Thursday's conversation ready to have an honest discussion about everyone's contributions to the family, not just the ones that showed up in a bank account. Marcus hung up. Priya called 20 minutes later. She was warmer than Marcus, which was always her method, the careful warmth that functions as a strategy. She said she understood Julian was upset. She said she wanted Julian to know that the family valued everything he did. She said they just needed to move quickly for Raymond's sake. Julian thanked her for calling and said he would see them Thursday. He did not change his position. Thursday came. The 4 of them sat in the family dining room again. Marcus had printed a revised proposal. It was slightly more generous to their mother, which told Julian that Marcus had done some legal research of his own in the past 48 hours and understood that the original plan had exposure. Julian brought his folder. He did not open it immediately. He set it on the table where everyone could see it. He said, before we look at proposals, I want to make sure we all have the same understanding of what has been contributed to this family over the years. Not just financially, all of it. Marcus said that was not the point of the meeting. Julian said it was the point of any honest conversation about this family's assets. He opened the folder. What followed was not a screaming match. It was quieter than that, and because of the quiet, it was much harder to dismiss. Julian went through the receipts. He went through the repair logs. He noted the dates, the costs, the improvements. He mentioned the loans without drama, just as facts, just as numbers with documentation attached. His mother sat very still. Marcus's face went through several changes. Priya studied her manicure. When Julian finished, he said simply that he was not trying to create a fight. He was trying to make sure that when this family made decisions about shared assets, it did so with a complete picture. He said he did not want to sue anyone. He said he wanted his mother protected properly, not as an afterthought. He said he wanted his contributions acknowledged in whatever legal structure the family put in place going forward. And he said that if the family could agree to those things, the folder went back into the drawer and they moved forward together. Marcus looked at him for a long time. The contempt was still there behind his eyes, but something else was there too. Something Julian had not seen in his brother's face before. Something that looked, if he had to name it, like recalibration. Marcus said he would need to talk to his lawyer. Julian said, take all the time you need. He gathered his folder, said goodbye to his mother, and drove home. He did not feel triumphant. He felt tired and sad in the way that telling the truth to people who preferred comfort always makes you feel. But underneath the sadness was something else, something solid, the particular piece of a man who finally stopped being the only one in the room without the information. 3 weeks later, Patricia Ose received a formal response from Marcus's attorney. The revised family agreement acknowledged Julian's historical contributions to the property in the amount of $21,000, which would be credited against any future division of estate assets. A separate fund was established from the sale of the property to ensure Diane's housing costs were covered for a minimum of 12 years. Julian was named as a co-trustee of that fund. It was not everything, but it was real, it was documented, it was legal. Julian signed the agreement on a Wednesday afternoon in Patricia's office, and then drove to school and taught a lesson on photosynthesis to a group of 7th graders who had no idea anything had happened. That was the other thing about being a teacher. The classroom did not wait for your personal life to resolve itself. It just kept going, and somehow that consistency was a gift. Raymond died 14 months later. The stroke had left him diminished, and a second one took what remained. The family gathered, and there was a grief in the room that was genuine, complicated grief, the kind that comes when you lose someone you both loved and were frustrated by in equal measure. Julian cried at the funeral, not for the father he had always wanted. For the one he had actually had, the real man, the imperfect man with the strong opinions and the factory job, and the way he used to whistle while he made coffee in the morning when he thought no one was listening. After the service at the reception, Marcus found Julian standing alone by the window with a paper plate of food he was not eating. Marcus stood next to him. They were quiet for a moment. Then Marcus said, "I know I have not always been fair to you." Julian looked at him. Marcus did not elaborate. He did not apologize with the kind of detail that would have actually meant something. But he said it, and Julian accepted it for what it was, not a full accounting, but a beginning. He said, "I know you didn't mean to be unfair. I think you just stopped seeing me." Marcus nodded slowly. He walked away. They did not hug. But the hostility had shifted into something more like a careful distance, which was, for that family, an improvement. Julian's life settled into a new rhythm. His mother moved into a small apartment near his own, funded by the trust. She learned slowly how to be a woman who was not managing someone else's chaos, and in doing that she became, in her mid-60s, someone Julian found he could actually talk to. They had lunch on Saturdays. She told him things about herself she had never mentioned before, small things, the dreams she'd had before marriage, the places she'd wanted to see, the fact that she had always wanted to learn to paint. Julian bought her a set of watercolor paints for her birthday and drove her to a community class. She cried a little when she opened the box. He was 45 years old, and his life was quieter than it had ever been and more genuinely his than it had ever been. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, there was a knock at his apartment door. Julian was grading papers at his kitchen table. He was not expecting anyone. He went to the door and opened it. The man standing in the hallway was tall, broad-shouldered, neatly dressed in a dark jacket over a gray shirt. He was somewhere in his late 20s. He had calm, steady eyes, and a way of standing that communicated a kind of settled, internal confidence that is not performed but earned. He was holding a manila envelope against his side. Julian did not recognize him immediately. He was still in the mode of a man who had been interrupted mid-grading. He looked at the man and waited. The man said, "Mr. Ockhaffer, my name is Darius Cole. You probably don't remember me, but I was in your fourth period science class when I was in 7th grade. You left a pair of shoes by my locker one Monday morning." Julian stood very still. Then something shifted in his chest. Not a dramatic thing, a quiet thing, like a gear settling into place after years of running slightly misaligned. He said, "I remember you." Darius nodded. He said, "I should have come sooner. I tried to find you a few years back, but I was still getting my footing, and it didn't feel right to show up without having something real to show for it." He paused. He said, "Can I come in?" Julian stepped back from the door and let him in. They sat at the kitchen table where Julian had been grading papers. Julian made tea because that was the thing he did when he needed a moment to organize himself. He brought 2 cups, and they sat across from each other in the quiet of the apartment. Darius talked for a long time. He talked about the shoes and what they had meant to him, not in abstract terms but in very specific ones. He said that at 12, he had been in a place where he had started to believe, in the way that children believe things that take root before they have the language to challenge them, that he did not matter to anyone outside his own small circle. He said the shoes had not just been shoes. They had been proof that someone outside his world had looked at him and decided he was worth something. He said it had shifted something in how he moved through the next years. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, like a compass that had been knocked askew and then quietly corrected. He talked about high school. He had been a good student, not in every subject, but in the ones that grabbed him, which were math and business and later economics. He had gotten a partial scholarship to a state university and had worked 2 jobs through most of his degree. He had graduated. He had gone into finance, not the glamorous kind, but the kind that actually worked with real people, community lending, small business support, the financial architecture of neighborhoods that banks had historically ignored. He had, over the past 4 years, built a small but real financial services company with 2 partners. It was not a headline company. It was a serious one. He pulled the manila envelope from beside his chair and set it on the table. He said, "I want to be honest with you about why I'm here. It is not just to say thank you, although I genuinely mean that. I am here because my company has been working on a community development project in this city, and in doing the research, I found out where you were still teaching, and I found out some things about your situation that made me want to come directly. Julian looked at the envelope. Darius said, "We are establishing a teacher recognition endowment tied to our community lending program. It is a real fund, it is legally structured, and we are looking for the first recipient, someone whose impact on a student's life can be documented and verified. I have written a 15-page account of what your intervention meant to my trajectory. My company's attorneys have reviewed it. The endowment is $50,000, held in your name, dispersed over 5 years, with no restrictions on how you use it." Julian did not speak for a moment. He looked at this man across his kitchen table and thought about an October classroom and a 12-year-old with a tilted walk and a peeling shoe. He thought about the Tuesday afternoon he had gone to a store by himself and bought $65 worth of shoes and socks and left them in a paper bag with no note. He thought about his brother's laugh at Thanksgiving dinner and the word sucker and the way his mother had looked at her plate. He said, "Darius, I cannot accept that." Darius said, "I knew you were going to say that." He did not look surprised. He said, "So I want you to hear me out before you say it again, and then you can decide." He said that the endowment was not pity and it was not charity. It was a formal acknowledgement inside a legal structure designed to honor a specific kind of contribution, the kind that does not show up on any performance review, the kind that happens in a quiet classroom when a teacher decides to see a child the system has made invisible. He said that Julian had changed the direction of his life, and that he had spent the past decade trying to figure out how to honor that in a way that matched the seriousness of it. He said this was as close as he had gotten. He said, "I am not doing this to make you feel good. I am doing this because it is true and because the truth deserves to be documented." Julian picked up his tea. He held it. He thought about truth and documentation, which was, he realized, something he had been thinking about in a different context for the past several years. He said, "Tell me more about the endowment, how it works, what the structure looks like." And Darius opened the envelope. What was inside was thorough. There was the legal framework of the endowment. There was Darius's written account, 15 pages, dense and specific and honest in the way that good writing is honest, without sentimentality, without exaggeration, with the kind of precise emotional clarity that comes from someone who has thought carefully about something for a very long time. There were letters from Darius's business partners. There were supporting documents from a nonprofit that had co-signed the educational mission of the endowment. And there was one more thing. There was a letter addressed to the school district's Board of Education, signed by Darius and his 2 partners, nominating Julian for the district's annual recognition award for exceptional long-term impact. The letter noted that Darius was prepared to appear in person at the board meeting to speak on Julian's behalf. Julian read that last part twice. He thought about his classroom. He thought about 30 years of 4th-period science classes. He thought about the peppermints and the staying late and the logging of every broken microscope and the writing of every recommend. Asian letter and the noticing of every child who walked with a tilt in their step for reasons they had not chosen. He said, "You did all of this." Darius said, "I started working on it 3 years ago." Julian set the papers down on the table. He looked at this man who had been a 12-year-old boy with no shoes that fit, and he thought about what it meant to be seen, and to carry that forward, to become someone who saw others, to build a life and a business around the specific work of paying attention to people the system keeps making invisible. He said, "Yes, I will accept the endowment." Darius exhaled, a small exhale, but Julian caught it. Julian understood that Darius had not been certain he would say yes, that the outcome had not been guaranteed, and the uncertainty of it, the fact that Darius had built all of this and come here not knowing what Julian would say, that meant something. It meant the gesture was real. They talked for 2 more hours, about Darius's company, about the community lending work, about Julian's students over the years, several of whom Darius had heard about through the small connected world of the city they shared, about Raymond's death and the family agreement and the things Julian had learned about letting the truth exist in the room rather than managing everyone else's comfort at the cost of his own reality. When Darius stood to leave, he shook Julian's hand. His grip was firm and held an extra second. Julian felt, in that extra second, the weight of everything they were not saying and the sufficiency of not having to say it. After Darius left, Julian stood at the window and looked out at the street below for a long time. It was March. The trees were still bare, but there was the early quality of light that means spring is coming, that particular light that is thin and sharp and full of something about to begin. He thought about the $65. He thought about Marcus at Thanksgiving dinner, the laugh, the word sucker. He thought about Patricia Ose, saying the difference between throwing a punch and letting someone know your hands are not tied behind your back. He thought about Claudette saying he had made the family his emotional home, instead of building one of his own. He thought about his mother learning to paint at 63. He thought about Darius at 12, sitting in the third row from the back with a tilted walk and a carefully neutral face, and he thought about how that boy had carried the memory of being seen across 2 decades and had turned it into a structure, a legal structure, with documents and letters and 15 pages of honest writing, as if to say, what you did was real. Here is the proof. Here is the record. Here it is in writing so that no one can laugh it away. Julian had always known that being good was not the same as being foolish. He had always known it. He had just spent most of his life in rooms where he was the only person who believed it. He was not in those rooms anymore. The board meeting was 8 weeks later. It was a regular board meeting, Tuesday evening in the district's main administrative building, a slightly tired room with fluorescent lighting and chairs that were not quite comfortable enough. Julian sat in the third row from the back, which he noticed only after he had sat down. The room was more full than usual. Julian had not told anyone he was coming. He had not made it an event. But several of his colleagues from the school were there, which suggested that word had gotten around in the way that certain things get around in a school community, quietly but completely. Darius spoke for 12 minutes. Julian did not expect to be moved by it. He had read the 15-page account. He had thought he knew what was coming. But there is a difference between reading and hearing, and when Darius Cole stood at the front of that room in his dark jacket and spoke in his calm, measured, precise voice about a 12-year-old boy who had learned for the first time that he could be seen without having to perform or earn it, Julian had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep his face steady. Darius did not make it dramatic. He did not make it sentimental. He described what had happened in clinical, careful terms, like a man giving evidence because that was what he was doing. He described the shoes. He described what the gesture had communicated. He described the years that followed, and the choices he had made, and the places where, at decision points, he had drawn on the specific knowledge that someone had decided he was worth a quiet act of dignity, and that knowledge had given him the foundation to believe his own choices could be serious. He said, teachers like Mr. Julian Ockhaffer are the reason some of us are sitting in rooms like this instead of somewhere much darker. And that is not a metaphor. It is a fact. The room was very quiet after he finished. Then it wasn't. Julian received the district recognition. Award that evening. There was a plaque, which he had not expected to move him as much as it did. There was a brief speech from the board chair. There was applause that lasted longer than he was comfortable with. A woman in the second row whom he had taught 16 years ago and who was now a pediatric nurse stood up when she applauded, and then so did the person next to her. And then the room did the thing rooms sometimes do when something true has been said clearly in front of enough people. Julian stood at the front of the room and held the plaque and did not know what to do with his hands or his face, which is, he thought, probably exactly how it should feel. He said thank you. He said the real thing to thank was the fact that teaching puts you in the same room as people at the moment when everything is still possible for them. And if you are paying attention, some of those moments are irreversible in the best way. He said he had been paying attention for 30 years and he intended to keep doing it. He looked at Darius Cole in the fourth row while he said it. Darius nodded. Once, that was enough. Marcus found out 3 weeks later, not from Julian, but from a mutual contact, because that was how information traveled in their world. He called Julian on a Saturday morning while Julian was making coffee. He said he had heard about the award and the endowment. He said, "That's a real thing? Someone actually came back after all these years to do that for you." Julian said yes. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "The kid with the shoes." Julian said yes. Marcus was quiet again. Julian could hear him breathing. He could hear something moving in the silence that he recognized as the sound a person makes when they are adjusting a belief they have held for a long time. It was not a comfortable sound, but it was an honest one. Marcus said, I think I owe you an apology, not just for Thanksgiving, for a lot of things. Julian said, I know, but you can take your time with that. And he meant it, not as cruelty, as genuine patience, as the particular generosity of a man who has stopped keeping score but has also stopped pretending there is no score. Priya sent a text message later that day. It said, Julian, I heard about the recognition and I want you to know we are really proud of you. Julian read it twice. He noticed the way it was phrased, we are really proud of you, as if the pride were hers to dispense, as if she had been part of this story in a way that licensed the pronoun. He texted back thank you and set the phone down. His mother cried when he told her. She held the plaque and traced the letters of his name with her finger. She said, I always knew, I just didn't always say it. Julian said, I know, Mom. She said, your father would have been proud. He was not always good at showing things, but he was proud of you. Julian thought about his father whistling over morning coffee. He said, I know he was. The endowment money arrived the following month. The first disbursement, $10,000, landed in Julian's account on a Friday. He sat with it for a few days. He thought about what he wanted to do with it. He did not need it for immediate expenses. The budget he had built over 30 years of careful living had given him stability he was grateful for. He called Darius. He said, I want to use some of the first disbursement to establish a small classroom fund at the school. Not in my name. Just a fund that any teacher in the building can access to buy supplies, or food, or occasionally shoes, for a student who needs it without having to navigate the district's requisition process. Darius said, I was hoping you were going to say something like that. Julian set up the fund with $5,000. He left no restrictions. He left no name on it. He told the principal that any teacher who needed to quietly support a student could apply for a small disbursement through a simple form, no justification required beyond the fact that they had noticed something. The principal looked at him for a moment. She said, where does this come from? Julian said, from someone who paid attention. She nodded and did not ask again. The classroom fund moved quietly through the school year. Julian knew it was being used because the balance decreased in small increments. He did not know the details, and he did not need to. The point was not to know. The point was to make the mechanism available. The point was to create, inside a system that was not built for it, a small space where a teacher could simply notice a child and act on it without requiring a three-form approval process. He knew, because he remembered, that the space between noticing and acting is where a lot of potential good gets lost. He refused to be part of that loss any longer. The school year ended. Julian collected another batch of summer reading from his 7th graders and stacked the papers on his desk in the empty classroom. The room S. Smelled like whiteboard marker and something like chalk, though they had not used chalk in years. The peppermint jar was down to 3 mints. He made a note to refill it before September. He sat at his desk for a while after the last student had left. He was 46 years old. He had a folder full of receipts in his home office that had changed his family's accounting. He had a legal agreement that protected his mother for 12 years. He had a plaque on his apartment wall that a man had spent 3 years preparing to give him. He had a classroom fund that was running quietly through the school system right now, finding children with tilted walks and peeling shoes and quietly correcting for it. He had $65 worth of running shoes and a 30-year career of paying attention to thank for all of it. He thought about what Marcus had called him at Thanksgiving all those years ago. He thought about the word sucker. He thought about how wrong that word was, not just morally but practically, not just as a judgment but as a prediction. He thought about how the people who mistake generosity for weakness tend to spend their lives surrounding themselves with other people who share that mistake, and how that shared mistake eventually creates a house of mirrors in which everyone reflects back the same distorted image until no one can see clearly anymore. Julian had never lived in that house. He had been invited into it many times. He had eaten dinner in it. He had fixed the porch on it. He had loaned money to it. But he had always driven home afterward to his own apartment, his own kitchen table, his own consistent quiet. That quiet had turned out to be worth something. He turned off the classroom lights and walked out of the building into the early summer afternoon. The parking lot was hot and empty. His car made its familiar sound as he started it. He rolled down the window. He drove home the way he always did, no particular hurry, paying attention to the road, to the light, to the small, ordinary, remarkable fact of being here and moving forward. He was not angry at the people who had underestimated him. Not anymore. He had passed through anger into something quieter and more useful, something that felt, if he had to name it, like a deep and specific gratitude for having been the kind of person who bought a pair of shoes for a 12-year-old boy in October and said, no note, no discussion, no announcement required. Because that boy had grown up, and that boy had remembered, and that boy had done the remarkable human thing of turning what he had received into something he could give forward. And the chain of that, the long, quiet, uninterrupted chain of one person seeing another person and deciding that seeing them was enough reason to act, that chain was still going. It was in the classroom fund right now, moving in small increments, finding children that the system kept making invisible, saying in the wordless way that certain gestures say things. You are here. You matter, someone noticed. Julian had started that chain with $65 and a paper bag. He pulled into his parking space and turned off the car. The summer ahead was quiet and his and full of possibility. He was ready for every bit of it. Julian never screamed. He never demanded. He never posted anything public or tried to humiliate anyone who had hurt him. He just kept records. He kept showing up. He kept being the person who noticed what everyone else walked past. And in the end, the truth did not need his help to speak. It spoke for itself, clearly, legally, on the record, in a room full of people who finally listened. Now I want to hear from you. Has someone in your life ever mistaken your kindness for weakness? Did they ever have to face the truth of what you actually were? Drop your story in the comments right now. And if you have someone in your life who needs to hear this today, share this video with them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a person is show them that staying kind was never the mistake.